What is going on, everyone? My name is Benjamin Nowak, and in today's video, I'm going to share with you everything that I wish I would have known about jerkbait fishing when I first started fishing. And when I say everything, I mean literally everything, from super basic to very advanced cadences, fish action, and things that I do with my bait to help me trigger bites from fish that otherwise wouldn't bite a jerkbait. So we're going to really dive into everything you need to know about jerkbait fishing. So whether you're a new angler or whether you're a very advanced fisherman, hopefully there's something you can learn in this video. Now, with that said, this is a different style of piece of content than what I've been putting out recently. We're diving really in depth, and it's a little bit longer form style of video. So if you enjoy this style of content, whether you're a new subscriber or old, I'd love to know what you guys think of this style of video. Go down there in the comment section, let me know, tell me if you like it, tell me what you didn't like, and ways that we can improve this piece of content to make it better in the future, because this is what is something I'm very passionate about. Diving really in depth on baits, techniques, patterns, and things that I'm experiencing on the water that might help you catch fish. Now, we're still going to do the fishing vlog style stuff where I take you in the camera and we're going to go out on the lake and catch a bunch of big fish, but this is another style of piece of content that gets me excited because I can really dive into stuff and break down the intricacies of things that maybe will be interesting to some of you guys. Without further ado, let's start to dive into the basics of jerkbait fishing. How to pick a jerkbait. And this seems really basic, but I think there's some things that we can all learn from this piece of information. So when I get on the water, how do I pick the jerkbait that I'm going to start throwing for the day? And the first consideration you have to understand is the depth that you're fishing. Now, when I start to look at a jerkbait, you're going to have shallow diving jerkbaits that have a short bill, that dive to about 3 to 6 foot, which is a pretty standard jerkbait depth. And then you're going to have deeper diving jerkbaits with a bigger bill that dive down to about 6 to 9 foot of water. Those are really the two starting depths. But another factor you have to consider is the actual action that jerkbait has out of the packaging. So if you look at a bait, you have to understand whether it sinks, whether it floats, or whether it perfectly suspends. So when you guys are buying jerkbaits, and this is something you can learn on the water as well, you take that jerkbait, you make a cast 10 to 15 foot from the boat, and you watch to see how that bait acts in the water, because it's going to dictate how deep you can fish it or how shallow you can fish the bait. Because what a lot of people don't recognize is that you can actually take these deeper diving jerkbaits and fish them in shallower water than they recommend to get it through different pieces of cover. And this is something I've really focused on over the past couple of seasons, is using deeper diving baits to help me more effectively fish wood and rocks and trigger fish to bite that otherwise wouldn't bite a shallower diving jerkbait. I'm talking like going on St. Clair, fishing in 6 foot of water with a deeper diving jerkbait and grinding this bait into pieces of wood, into the rocks, and making those fish that are on bottom and normally not eating a jerkbait to trigger on these baits. So understand the way that that bait acts in the water and understand how deep you can fish it, because that's going to impact the depth you can fish that bait. Now, conversely, you can take a bait like this shallow diving Berkeley Stunna, and this actually sinks out of the package. So you might want to fish it in 3 to 4 foot of water, but what you're not going to recognize is on a long pause, this thing's going to end up on the bottom. So this bait out of the packaging will sink. It will have a slow sink to the bait. But what that's nice for is if you want to fish this bait deeper, and you want to fish it around grass, or you want to fish it in more open water for those fish that you're looking at on your live scope, you can use these shallower diving baits that sink, or you can make your baits sink to fish effectively. So understand the way your baits act in the water. That's also going to be a huge indicator, or a huge thing to consider when you're choosing your diving depth or fishing depth with certain baits. The next thing I'm going to focus on is the bait color and the water clarity and conditions that I'm fishing. So I don't really carry that many different styles of colors of jerkbait. Now, it looks like I have a bunch of baits. A lot of them are relatively similar in color because I fish mostly the same styles of bodies of water. So what I'm considering here is the bait clear? Is it not clear? Is the bait natural? Is the bait bold? And then does it have chartreuse? Which, especially when I'm fishing smallmouth, I really love to have a flash of chartreuse or a flash of bold color on that bait. Maybe not the whole thing, but a little flash of that bold color on the bait. So when I'm fishing really clear bodies of water and the sun is out, I like to fish clearer style baits, or very natural style baits. I want a bait that's going to look natural in that clean water where those fish can see it a long ways away and they can say, okay, that's a minnow, that is a bait fish, that is a perch, whatever you might want your bait to look like. You want it to look natural in clear bodies of water when the sun's out. You might also want a bait that will draw fish from long ways away in clean water, and that's when I'm going to pick up a flashy or chrome style bait like this. So really two opposites here, but you want a bait that either looks really natural when it's clear and sunny, or you want a bait that has a ton of flash that will draw fish from long distances, because when it's sunny out, that sun's going to hit the sides, it's going to flash a lot. So those are the two main considerations when I'm fishing clean water and the sun's out. I'm also going to consider picking up these flashy sided baits if it's sunny and the water is off color, because these are opaque sides. They are not see-through. They are baits that reflect light. So they're going to silhouette well, even in dirtier or more off-color bodies of water. The other thing is that when that sun's out, again, it's going to reflect light and draw fish from long distances. So anytime there's a lot of sun, this is a bait consideration where you have a lot of flash, because it will draw fish even in dirtier water situations. Now, when I'm fishing in overcast conditions where there's not as much sunlight or the water is dirty, I'm going to be picking baits that have solid sides, solid base colors, baits that are not see-through. The reason this is important is it will silhouette better in dirtier water situations. Now, the dirtier that the water is, the more bold I'm going to go, whether it's this fire cross style color or it's a bright chartreuse. As that water gets dirtier, that's where I'm going to pick more bold colors. But for the most part, if that water gets off colored or it's overcast, I'm picking a bait with solid sides, because it's going to help allow those fish to actually see it in that darker sky conditions or dirtier water conditions. And that's when I'm going to pick up those whiter based or solid side baits. So we've talked about color, we've talked about diving depth. Now we're going to talk about action, because this is very critically important, especially in different water temperatures. Fish will react differently to different actions on baits. And I don't have a ton of experience with baits from all different manufacturers, but I'm going to give you my favorites and kind of how I use them in different water situations. So for the past couple of seasons, a Berkley Stunna has gotten a ton of love from me. This is a bait that really works effectively in a variety of different water temperatures and conditions. It's a bait that has a loose action, but doesn't really move that much water. So what I mean by this is when you hit this bait, it's going to dart, but then when it is on the pause, it's going to have a really nice shimmy. It's not going to dart huge distances. It's not going to roll a lot or flash a lot, but it does have a nice shimmy on the pause. So this is a really good all-around style jerkbait. The Berkley Stunna is a bait that I think is still new to the market, so it triggers fish to bite when maybe other jerkbaits wouldn't. But it's definitely not the crisp jerkbait that you would expect from a megabass. It's a little bit looser, it has a little shimmy on the pause, and it has a little roll. Now, the Stunna 112 regular is going to sink on the pause. This is something that I briefly mentioned earlier, but when you stop this bait with stock components, this bait will actually slow sink. Versus the 112 plus one, which is the deeper diving model, this is actually a harder bait to get in deeper water than about 6 foot. The reason for that is because this bait doesn't sink as effectively. It also has a little bit flatter sides, so it's not going to maybe roll quite as much as a shallow diving model. What that means is you can take your 112 regular and actually sink it down. If you're using forward facing, you need to get a bait deeper. This is a bait that's a little bit easier to get to deeper depths than your 112 plus one. Your 112 plus one, on the other hand, is going to be a bait that you can fish around cover effectively, has that bigger diving bill, and if I'm fishing around wood or I want a bait that I can grind into the bottom, I'm going to go with the 112 plus one from Berkley. The next one we're going to talk about is megabass jerkbait, and the jerkbait nuts out there are going to kind of lose their minds when I say I don't fish a regular 110 jerkbait. The reason for that is I think there's other jerkbaits that fit that same situation for me, but the 110 plus one is a bait I fish a lot. It's a bait I have a ton of control over, and it's very crisp and specific. Out of the box with stock components, this bait will perfectly suspend at about 6 or 7 foot depending on your line size. It also has a very unique hopping action, so when you fish this bait, it will almost come up and then pause, nose down, at about 6 or 7 foot of water. It like hops in the water, and it's super crisp. It has a moderate amount of flash. I wouldn't say it has a ton, but I wouldn't say it has zero. It's a pretty flat-sided bait, but it will like do this hopping action in the water, and I found this to be really effective in colder water situations. And it's a very easy bait to control the depth of. And this is something I do by modifying the hooks, which we'll get into later in the video. So if you want a bait that is a good cold water bait, it gets down to about 6 foot, and maybe is a little bit pricier than other baits on the market, but has incredible components, the Megabass 110+1 version is the one that I have the most experience with. It's a great jerk bait that catches a lot of fish. The next two jerk baits are from Duo Realis, and it's two different sizes of the bait that I like to fish. Now, when you put these baits side by side, they look relatively similar. I'm talking the 100 size and the 120 size, but they're very different baits. So the Duo Realis 100 is a smaller profile jerk bait. It's 100 millimeters long. What I really like this bait for is active aggressive fish in the early spring in warming water when they're up in shallower water conditions, when they're less than 10 foot of water. This is an incredible bait. The reason I like this is it has very rounded sides. So I don't know if you guys can tell in this video here, but the rounded sides give this bait a lot of roll and flash. And when this bait is on the pause, it has like a little secondary shimmy or secondary action that gets a lot of bites when this bait is sitting still. It also kind of does a hopping action, and it's just a really good smaller profile style jerkbait. And when those fish are up on those flats, they're actively feeding, this is probably going to be one of my go-to jerkbaits. And this is a bait I catch a ton of fish on, warming water in the spring. This is a bait, and in the fall, this is a bait that I really like to throw, the Duo Realis 100 size. One thing you're going to notice about this bait is it doesn't have a weight transfer system, and I thought that was going to be an issue. It casts really effectively. The way that weight is fixed in this bait, you can still cast it a really long distance, even though it's a smaller profile bait, even though it doesn't have a weight transfer. And it also has a very different sound than a lot of jerk baits on the market with just a single or couple BBs in the bait itself. So really unique jerk bait. I really like it when those fish are actively feeding in shallower water. The next is the 120 size. And this is a bait I've played with over the past couple of seasons. And you might say a 120 size jerkbait, that thing is huge. This is a bait that draws fish from a long ways away. It also flashes an incredible amount. But that doesn't mean that it rolls a lot. It's actually got really tall sides. So it will kind of flash and then get back to center. Flash and get back to center. It's a very tight action jerkbait. It dives to about 6 foot of water, so a little bit deeper than the regular 110, but it has an incredible amount of drawing power. This is a bait that has caught me a lot of big fish when I want to pull them from long distances. So this 120 size, it's a bigger style bait, but it catches a lot of fish when you want to pull them from long distances, and I think this bait gets slept on a lot because it is a 120 size jerkbait. So if you're looking for a bigger body bait, you want a bait that will pull fish from long distances, maybe give you a different profile in the water, I would look at the Duo Realis 120. And again, incredible components. This is a bait that out of the box is ready to fish. Doesn't really sink, maybe super slow sink, but it's very well put together and balanced straight out of the box. And then finally, kind of a sleeper bait that I haven't really talked about much on the channel. My buddy Zach Hall is the one that keyed me in on this, and then we caught mega bags on this thing, is the Jackal Re-Range. I'm going to have a video coming out where I catch a bunch of fish on the Jackal Re-Range in the perch color, but this is a bait that I would say is between the Stunna and the Duo. It doesn't really have a super wide flashing action, but it has a little bit more than the Stunna, a little bit less than the Duo. This is just a really good jerkbait. It also has an incredible weight transfer system, so you can cast this thing 1.5 miles away. Really good weight transfer system. Good colors. There's a little knock in there from that tungsten that's clicking back and forth. It's a really unique jerkbait, definitely one that I keep in my arsenal. It also sinks out of the box super slow, less than a foot a second, so you have a lot of control over this bait. But this is a bait that I really enjoy throwing when I want to sink a bait early season. So now that we've talked about picking the bait, we need to talk about picking the right rod. And in my opinion, other than the bait, this is the most important component. You need a rod that's going to work the bait effectively, but not pull these little treble hooks free when you do hook a really big fish. And a lot of times with the jerkbait, you hook them funny, they're in the side of the face, they just got one hook. So you need a rod that will give you the leverage that you need to maintain that good hook set into the fish. So what I'm looking for in a rod is to have the right power and action. That's the very first thing I consider. Before I look at length, before I look at the butt section of the rod, I need a rod that will allow me to cast this bait effectively, about a medium power, and then has a soft enough tip where when these fish bite and I set the hook, it's not going to immediately rip that bait free. So what I'm using is a TFO Tactical Elite medium cranking rod. They call it a cranking rod, but the tip's still fast enough where I can fish this bait effectively, but when these fish get these small treble hooks, that cranking rod bends deep enough down the blank, bends deep enough into the rod to keep these fish pinned. The next thing I'm going to consider is the butt section of the rod. Now, why is this important when you're fishing a jerkbait? Because the butt section is what's going to allow you to work the bait with your wrist and with your forearm. Okay, so too long of a rod is going to get tucked up under your armpit, and you're not going to be effective working that bait. It's also going to really, really work you to fish that bait. More than that, it's not going to let you work that bait to get the most out of it. You need to be snappy and point that rod tip right back at that jerkbait so that bait darts and then kind of can come back to center. Darts and come back to center. Versus if you snap a bait and that rod gets stuck down, that bait snaps and just dies. It doesn't have that kind of comeback to center. So having a rod with a shorter butt section that allows you to really have control over your wrist and over your arm when you're making these movements is really, really important. And then finally, I like a longer rod. And this is really preference. I like a 7-foot casting rod. Because when I'm fishing these smallmouth in really clear water, I want to get this bait as far away from me as I possibly can. Having a little bit extra length lets me make longer casts, but it still doesn't slap the water. So you need kind of that happy medium between like a 6'6", 6'9", and like a 7'3", where you can work the bait effectively. You're not slapping the water, but you can get that bait away from you. And for me, this TFO Tactical Elite 7-foot medium cranking rod is probably my favorite jerkbait rod. I've also really been playing with the TFO Resolve 7-foot medium. They call it a 7-foot medium fast. It has a very similar action to that Tactical Elite. It's just a little bit higher components. It's a lighter blank, lighter components, so I can fish this bait with a little bit less fatigue throughout the day. So those are the rods that I'm using when I'm fishing a jerkbait. And when we start to talk about reel, in my opinion, reel is like almost unimportant when you're fishing a jerkbait. You need a reel that will cast long distances, relatively high speed. I'm fishing an 8-speed gear ratio reel. And the reason that's important is because when those fish eat that bait and you need to pick up line because they're coming to you, you need to be able to pick up that line quickly. So it wouldn't go anything less than 7-speed, but really as long as you have like a good 7-speed gear ratio reel that will let you cast a long ways, that's what I would recommend. And when we talk about line, my biggest consideration is the depth that I need to get that bait, the cover that I'm fishing around, and then the action that I need that bait to have. So most of the time I'm fishing 12-pound test fluorocarbon line. I feel like that's the happy medium. It lets me work the bait about to what the bait's rated for, and then if I need to sink the bait or I need to float the bait, I can modify it from there. If I'm fishing around wood or I'm fishing around cover where I need to really dredge that bait into bottom, I'll probably bump up to about 14-pound test. That's about the top limit, 14, 15-pound test. But if I need to get that bait deeper and I really want to work that bait with as light of weight on that bait as possible to sink it, I'll go down to 10, especially if I'm fishing open water situations. But most of the time I'm fishing 12-pound test fluorocarbon line. I've also experimented with a spinning rod. I play with the spinning rod a little bit, but for me, that's only in very certain situations where maybe I need to cast a bait on a spinning rod because it's too light, doesn't have a weight transfer, and it's not something that I have a ton of experience with. The other consideration is fluorocarbon. I really like fluorocarbon. This is a bait that I catch a lot of fish on a long pause. Okay, so it's limited stretch. It does have a little bit of stretch, but it's virtually invisible underwater. It's the most clear out of all the fishing lines. So using fluorocarbon line is going to give me the best chance when those fish get really finicky and they want to look at the bait to trick these fish into biting because they can't see the line as effectively. Now, monofilament has a little bit more stretch. The other negative for me about monofilament is that it floats. And then I guess the other negative is that it's bigger diameter. So fluorocarbon for me is the best of all the worlds. And braid to me, even though it has smaller diameter, is not invisible, and I believe it doesn't stretch enough. So you pull hooks a lot of the times if you're fishing braid to fluorocarbon. Now, you guys can have your own opinions, but those are my opinions on why I fish 12-pound test fluorocarbon line. And I use Sunline Sniper pretty much exclusively when I'm fishing a jerkbait because it has the best combination of line diameter with breaking strength and abrasion resistance that I've found. Other people can have different opinions on that as well, but that is my personal preference. 12-pound test, Sunline Sniper, 10-pound test, 14-pound test, Sunline Sniper is what I'm throwing on my jerkbaits. The other thing about line that I want to mention is line diameter will impact the way that your bait works in the water. So lighter line is going to give your bait more action because it's going to impede the movement less. It's going to have a smaller diameter, so it's going to let that bait work more naturally, more so as it was designed. Heavier pound test line, if you want a bait that's going to act really natural, act the way they designed the bait to act, heavier pound test line is going to impede that action. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're picking out line size as well. It's something maybe you don't have to super consider, but it's something maybe just to notice when you're fishing heavier pound test line, lighter pound test line, the way that bait acts and darts. Lighter pound test is also going to have a little bit more stretch. Heavier pound test is obviously going to have less stretch. So those are some other considerations as well when you're picking out line diameters for your jerk baits that you're fishing. And line diameter is really important with this presentation for diving depth as well as for abrasion resistance. So kind of keep that in mind when you're picking lines for jerkbait fishing. The next thing we're going to talk about is choosing hooks for your jerkbait. And I'm just going to grab one right here, which is the Duo Realis. Some jerkbaits come with really premium components. Okay, so Duo Realis, I do not change the hooks on. Megabass, I don't change the hooks on unless I want to modify the bait. Berkeley, I do not change the hooks on. Jackal, I'll change the hooks on. Lucky Craft, I'll probably change the hooks on. And I think those are most of the jerkbaits that I have in my jerkbait box. So most of them, I don't change the hooks. Jackal, Lucky Craft, I will change the hooks on if I want them to act a certain way. Okay. Another consideration when I'm choosing the hooks that I'm using is to control the depth of the bait. Okay, so if I'm not changing the hook, it's going to have very natural action. If I change the hooks and I want it to have natural action, I have to match the weight and the size. And if I want the bait to sink, I can control the depth by changing the hooks. Now this is a Berkeley Stunna. It naturally sinks out of the packaging. If I want it to sink faster, I want to make my Duo sink, whatever, I can either change the weight of the hook, so using a hook that is a little bit beefier, go from like a light wire hook to a regular wire hook, or I can go up a size with a shorter shank. My buddy Nathan is the one that really got me into this, but essentially taking a bait that has normally number 6 size hooks with a regular shank and go into a number 4 shorter shank hook. It's going to have a little bit more weight. It's going to let me sink that bait at a little bit faster rate, and those hooks are going to be a little bit beefier. So that's another option as well. But choosing hooks is critically important, and I'm sure if you guys have watched any Megabass discussion videos, choosing hooks is critically important for controlling the way that bait will act in the water, whether it sinks or floats. So you guys can control your sink rate or your float rate based on hooks. Another huge consideration when I'm choosing hooks is not only controlling the sink rate, but the style of hook that I'm using. And most of the time when I'm fishing a jerkbait, I would say 90% of the time when I'm fishing a jerkbait, I will fish a round bend treble hook. What that means is your hook will come down and it will point up. It's like if you were drawing a hook in art class, your fishing hook would make a J. When you fish an EWG, extra wide gap hook, your hook naturally, the style of that hook wants to point those hook points back towards the body. It's really, really effective when those fish are eating the bait well. But when those fish are slapping at your bait, which they do a lot with the jerkbait, those fish tend not to get hooked as much because those hook points are turned inwards. So it keeps fish pinned really effectively when they get the hook, but a lot of times when your fish slaps at the bait with an EWG, they can tend to miss actually getting the hook point. Your round bend, that hookup percentage goes up drastically, which is why I fish a round bend almost exclusively on a jerkbait. Now, there is a new hook or a newer hook to the market that I'm going to let out of the bag. And Duo Realis is the one that kind of showed me this style of hook. And I'm going to put an image up right here. It's sort of a hybrid between an EWG and a round bend. So what the hook actually does is it kind of does your J shape. Like an EWG, it starts to point inwards, and then the hook point actually comes back out like a round bend style hook. Duo Realis sells these treble hooks. Another company is named Ichikawa, and they have regular bend hooks, they have light wire hooks, they have short shank hooks, and a variety of different of this style of hook that I like to use on my jerkbait. The reason this style of hook is so nice is because it's a combination of a round bend and an EWG. When you hook a fish with this style of hook, I very, very rarely had them pull off. The reason for that is they'll slap at the bait, they'll be able to get that kind of out barb or that out point on the hook, and then once they're locked into that turn section, they tend to stay pinned really effectively. So this is my favorite style of hook if I'm going to replace treble hooks, is this Ichikawa or Duo Realis jerkbait hook or treble hook. This is my favorite style of treble hook on the market because it is the best combination for me of both styles of round bend and EWG style hook. We're going to talk about bait adjustments just really quick, especially when we talk about hooks. One thing you want to consider is if you're changing hooks and that bait starts to sink really fast like a rock, you don't want that bait to sink that quickly. I like my baits to sink about a foot every couple seconds, really, really slowly sink. I don't want that bait to sink like a rock. It's really hard to control, and when that bait's paused, it's just going to look unnatural. It's going to sink. There are going to be times where that's the deal, but like most of the time, if you're changing your hooks and that bait's sinking really quickly, those fish are going to get turned off by it. So like a mega bass is really easy to sink. My favorite hook, if I'm going to change out the hooks and want this to sink slowly, are an Owner ST36. Okay, so as I change the hooks on my mega bass, if I want this bait to sink, Owner ST36 has been the best for me at letting me control that sink rate to where I want it to be. Those are my favorite hooks. But you also have to consider the split rings you're using and every other component that you're changing out when you're changing the hooks. If your bait sinks like a rock, in my opinion, that's not what you want in a sinking jerkbait. You want one that sinks extremely, extremely slowly. It takes a little bit of patience, but in my opinion, it helps you get more bites. But the next thing we need to discuss, now that we've talked about the basics, how to pick your jerkbait, rod, reel, line, hook setup, now we need to talk about cadence. And this is where things get a little more subjective, and we're going to start to kind of talk about experiences and how it can help you on the water. So cadence for me, what it means is the way that you work the bait or the pattern with which you work the bait to make fish bite. Now the biggest key here is this is going to be the last thing you do before that fish actually makes the decision whether it bites your bait or not. For me, there's a couple of different cadences, and it's really going to depend on fish movement, fish action, and something that I've been able to dial in a little bit more and obviously more quickly is the cadence that I use with forward-facing sonar. Now, this is not a discussion on whether or not you need this technology, but it will help you, and it's something to pay attention when you're fishing a jerkbait using forward-facing sonar. I think this is what sets guys apart, like Patrick Walters and some of the other forward-facing experts, Ben Milliken, is their ability to determine fish mood, fish activity, based on how they're reacting to their jerkbait. So in general, in warming water with more active fish, my cadence is going to be faster. When the water temps are rising and I'm out there on the water, I'm going to work faster cadence. If I'm fishing around smallmouth, I'm typically going to use a faster cadence. If I'm fishing shallower, I'm going to fish a faster cadence. Now, as that water cools or the water is cold, I'm going to use a slower cadence, more time between times I pull the bait. If I'm fishing largemouth, I'm going to fish a slower cadence. Those fish don't tend to be as aggressive. They don't tend to come up as far to get that bait as quickly as a smallmouth would. If I'm fishing deeper water situations, when those fish have to travel longer distances, I'm going to fish slower cadence to let that fish have more time to close the deal. That's just the super general overview of this, but it's something you can dial in, and I encourage you guys to play with different cadences throughout the day. Now, a cadence does not just have to be working the bait forward with your wrist. Another really cool cadence that I've started to dial in, especially in cold water situations, is you jerk that bait twice or 3 times, you let that bait pause, and then instead of jerking that bait, you either sweep your rod forward just a little bit, with what that's going to make your bait do is just kind of pull forward with very, very limited movement, and that can trigger fish to bite. The other cadence that I've been playing with, and this is something I caught a bunch of fish on a couple weeks ago, and my buddy Caleb Bell kicked my butt on about 2 years ago, was jerk, jerk, that bait's sitting still, and then he'll reel that bait. And what that will do is kick it forward 2 to 3 feet. This is really, really important to pay attention to because Caleb catching those fish on the reel allowed him to be incredibly more effective. The difference between a reel cadence and popping with your rod or pulling it is a reel cadence going to be a quick movement forward. Pop is going to cause that bait to dart. A pull cadence is just going to cause that bait to scoop. Okay, so there is a difference between a reel, a pull, and a pop. Pay attention to when those fish are biting. on which movement in your cadence. Also pay attention to how many times you pulled that bait before that fish decided to bite. If it's pop, pop, pause, pop, 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 pause, they bit it on the second pause. Okay, well, it's that pop, pop, pop that fish liked. It drew them from a long distance, and all fish have different attitudes, but you're going to notice throughout the day which cadence those fish like more. But cadence is very, very critically important. So kind of keep in mind to pay attention to that. You can also use forward-facing sonar to see the way those fish physically react to a bait, and a lot of times what I've noticed on forward-facing is those fish, they'll come up, they'll dart up, and they'll get right behind that bait, and a lot of times when they do this is specifically with forward-facing sonar, they'll get right behind that bait. When they do that, I found it less effective to jerk that bait again and more effective to either pull that bait, just scoot it forward, or use a small reel turn to get that bait to kind of just scoot forward quickly. This, to me, I think what happens is when that fish goes to move again, the bait's not moving out of a strike zone, it's just scooting forward, and when that fish goes to move, he just runs into the back of it. A lot of times those fish will overtake the bait, they'll actually get baits in their mouth, but when that bait scoots forward and they come up to get it, and they'll bump your bait and you'll feel them. The second you go to pull that bait, you end up with them hooked in the side of the face with one hook in the mouth. I just think they run into the bait. When they get that close to it and that bait scoots forward, they go to overtake or move towards it even further, and they just get the hook somewhere in their face. So really pay attention to that. With forward-facing, it lets you do that a lot more effectively, but you can do that without forward-facing sonar. Just keep in mind and pay attention to the cadence that you're using when a fish decides to bite. And I would be really interested to hear some of your stories about different cadences you use to catch fish. And kind of the way that those fish bite and the way that they're hooked when you use those different cadences. Like on my pulls and on my reels, those fish tend to get the bait like around the side of the head, which leads me to believe those fish are right behind the bait, goes to scoop forward, and instead of it darting away from their face, like it literally, they just run into the bait, and then you go to pop it again and it gets them on the side of the head. I'd be really interested to know what you guys have experienced on the water and maybe how this and different cadences impact the way those fish eat the bait. So discussing cadence is really going to lead us into our next point, which is fish activity. And this is going to have a huge impact on pretty much your entire jerkbait setup, from the bait you use to the way you fish the bait and a bunch of other things throughout the day. So notice and pay attention to the way that these fish are eating your bait, how they're setting up on the pieces of cover that you're fishing, how they're reacting to the way your bait is coming through the water, reacting to different colors. Pay attention to all of these factors. Are these fish up on the flat, actively feeding, aggressively moving around, roaming, willing to come long distances to eat that bait? Are they smoking the bait? Are they up there shallow and you go to jerk and that fish hits the bait super hard? Do they just kind of get on the back treble hook? How are these fish acting? A lot of times one thing that I've noticed is that these fish, if they're coming long distances, I can fish a bait with a lot more roll to trigger more fish to bite. Baits with a lot of roll are going to flash a lot. It's going to show the bait a lot to these fish. And if they're coming long distances, using those baits that will roll and flash are going to draw them from further distances. You can also modify the color that you're fishing. And this is something that has been really critically important over the past couple of seasons, is paying attention to the color that these fish are keying in on. Whether that's supernatural colors, whether there needs to be a little chartreuse in that bait, whether you need a more opaque style bait, whether it needs to be more natural, change the forage that you're trying to imitate. Paying attention to which bait tends to get the most feedback, tends to get the most bites, can help you dial in and get more bites throughout a day, as well as bigger bites. So color to me is somewhat subjective. That's why you don't hear me talking about specific colors, but using baits that trigger or elicit different feedback responses from these fish. You notice them following certain baits. You notice them eating certain baits from the head first, from the back treble hook. These can clue you in on different things to modify on your baits to end up helping you catch more fish. Like one thing you'll notice is I have a little red around the gills of this bait. I am a big believer that these fish having a target spot to come in and key in on is really, really important, especially with jerk baits. Whereas they can just come up and grab any part of the bait. I believe that little red, and I've seen that little bit of red help me get fish to commit more easily to this bait in certain conditions. So paying attention to these small details, including fish activity, can be critically important to making differences throughout your day because you can make adjustments more quickly. And forward-facing sonar, I hate to harp on this thing, but forward-facing sonar helps you make these adjustments much, much more quickly. Pay attention to how these fish are acting on your jerkbait on forward-facing. Now, this is probably the part that most of you guys came to see. We're talking about bait adjustments to help you adjust your bait and action in the water. Now, we've talked about most of these, whether it's line size or hook diameter, but another thing I want to talk about is some color that I'm adding to the baits and some things that I do maybe to help me trigger some fish to bite. So obviously color is a huge factor. We just got done discussing that, but one thing I like to add is target spots. We talked about the red on that last bait, but this is a bait that has typically no color. It's just a very realistic, natural minnow style pattern. ND Wakasaki, which is, I believe, just nude Wakasaki. I add a little bit of chartreuse to the bait. Most of my baits, if I'm smallmouth fishing, will have some target spot. My goal for that bait is to have an area for that smallmouth to key in on and come up and feed on. I do not want that smallmouth getting up to this bait and deciding, okay, I can hit that bait anywhere. I want it to say, okay, that is where I'm hitting this bait, towards the head of the bait, and that's going to help them key in on a spot to hit the bait. I've seen this with blade baits. I've seen this with swim baits. I've seen this with jerk baits, obviously, where these fish, when you don't have an area where that fish can key in, they'll eat the bait funny, okay? For blade baits, I need to have eyes on those baits. For swim baits, I have to have eyes where it will give it a little bit of flash. For swim jigs, it's a huge thing. Like, having a target spot, especially when you're fishing for smallmouth bass, is critically important. And this is something I've done and do to get more bites from smallmouth that I would encourage you guys trying. Another thing would be adding suspend dots to your bait. Let's say you get a bait out of the pack, it has super premium components, you love the way it fishes, but you want that bait to sink. Modifying the sink rate of that bait using a suspend strip or a suspend dot is a really, really good way to do that. Another thing that I've been doing recently is actually modifying it by adding a small weight. And there's a company called Machine that makes these weights that you can attach to your bait to get it to slow sink. Now, obviously, you can do that with the hook size, you can do it with the suspend dots, but the reason I like this little weight is I can get super, super detailed on how much weight I add to this thing to make it super slow sink. I can clip that weight really easily. I can take it off. I can use it on a different bait. It's really, really economical and it's really easy to add to the bait. So I believe that we talked about pretty much everything that I know about jerkbait fishing. I'm sure there's things about the way fish are positioned that you guys might want to know. And if there is anything that you think I missed in this video, let me know down in the comment section below. Let me know your thoughts, comments, feedback, experiences on the water with the jerkbait, because I'd love to know the success that you guys are having as well. So if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see another tip style video, click this video right here. Hit the subscribe button if you're not already. All the products that I talked about are going to be linked down in the description below. Take you to Omnia to check all of this stuff out. As always, thank you guys for watching. Take care, tight lines. God bless. Pursue passion.